Hey, what's going on guys? So AMD have finally let the reins off the B450 chipset, which has allowed a fresh lineup of boards like the one that we're going to look at today to finally be available to you guys. Now, I don't know why it took them this long to release the B450 chipset, seeing as X470 has been released for over 3 months now, since the release of second generation Ryzen CPUs. If anything, it was probably to encourage consumers to purchase higher end, more expensive boards, and then justify spending a bit more on the CPU as well. Now, in terms of the differences of B450 over B350, on paper, they're pretty much exactly the same. Identical USB, SATA, and PCI Express connectivity. The only difference is that B450 has some finer tuning when it comes to CPU clock speed boost. Now, despite barely any difference between them on paper, I'd highly recommend opting for a B450 motherboard at the moment over a cheaper B350. The first one is the fact that you're getting second generation Ryzen CPU support out of the box, and the second one is that you have improved memory support compared to B350 and first gen Ryzen CPUs. So the board that we're looking at today is, in my opinion, perfect for Ryzen 5 focused ITX builds, and maybe even for those looking at Ryzen 7 CPUs, but more on that later. This is the MSI B450i Gaming Plus AC. Pricing has not been confirmed yet, but be sure to check the links in the description for that. But regardless of price, this is a pretty solid board. Now, let's start off with the most important topic here, the VRM layout, and then we'll talk about the rest of the features and then finally talk about overclocking. So MSI haven't cut any corners here for the VRM, which is great to see for a middle of the road RTX motherboard. And here we're getting a true 6+2 phase VRM, which is controlled by an IR35201 PWM controller. And the MOSFETs being used here were seriously unexpected, in a good way that is. These are the IR3555s, which are 60 amp integrated power stages. Fun fact, these are the same MOSFETs that are used on ASUS's Crosshair Hero 7, which is a top of the line X470 board. And for more reference, the components here are higher grade in terms of efficiency and the number of true phases than their X470 Gaming Plus, which uses a doubled 4-phase for the V-Core VRM. So overall, a pretty solid VRM here, which is pretty much as good as the mainstream X470 VRMs out there. And this yielded a nice overclock for the 2700X of 4.2 GHz at 1.42 volts, which is pretty much identical to what I got on the X470 Aorus Gaming 7 and the X470 Gaming M7 from MSI. Other important notes on the board though, we've got a single M.2 slot here located on the back, pretty much the only place to locate one on such a cramped board. And there's also support for 32 GB of memory total with speeds up to 3466 MHz. I had no issues getting this 16 GB kit of 3200 MHz CL14 memory from Team Group up to the full 3200 just by enabling it in XMP. I/O is cut back a little bit compared to what you'll find on some X470 boards. Here we're getting 2 USB 2.0, 2 3.1 Gen 1, and 2 3.1 Gen 2 ports with unfortunately no Type-C. We've also got Intel Wi-Fi connectivity with 802.11ac support, and onboard antennae are included. I always prefer these ones over the wired ones. Design on the board is in line with their Gaming Plus branding, which is overall blacked out with some red accents on the heatsink. Overall, I think it looks pretty good. I like that the chipset heatsink has some resemblance of a fin stack. Just wish we saw that on the VRM heatsink. Alright, now let's go back to the VRM and let's talk about temperatures under full load. Now, MSI have done a pretty good job in terms of cramming a really solid VRM on a mainstream ITX board, but there are a couple things that are just out of their control. Now, the first thing is that we're working with an ITX board here, which means that you can only make the heatsink for the V-Core VRM so big before you start interfering with clearance of other components. Secondly is that we have support for up to an 8-core CPU here, up to currently the 2700X, and it can be overclocked. And when you pair those two things together, 2700X at full load, so for example, 4.2 GHz at 1.42 volts, that's when VRM temps are going to get a little bit out of control. And I've mentioned this in a few of my other videos, talking about Ryzen and motherboard support and whatnot. And that's that if you are planning on getting a Ryzen 7 CPU and a B350 or a B450 motherboard, don't plan to overclock the absolute crap out of that chip because the VRMs absolutely will not support it. And finally, I get to show you guys what I've been talking about. So with the 2700X overclocked to 4.2 GHz at 1.42 volts in Blender, I did manage to get the V-Core VRM to hit a thermal limit at 127 degrees C after 12 minutes, at which point the system safely shut down. Once I introduced a fan beside the open test bench, I was able to hold steady here at 115 degrees C. If you're going to be running an 8-core chip at stock though, which is highly recommended unless you really need that extra 200 to 300 MHz for an unreasonable trade-off in power draw and heat, the V-Core VRM will sit happily around 90C, and with active cooling inside your case, you could easily get that down to around 80. And again, these VRM temperatures don't reflect a low efficiency MOSFET or, a too low a phase count for the VRM. It's more so to say that, look, it's an ITX board, there's a tiny heatsink, and there are going to be some thermal limitations if you are going to overclock a Ryzen 7 CPU as far as you can, and then run as intensive of a workload as you can. There are going to be some thermal limitations, and as I say in every motherboard review that includes a Ryzen CPU, you're going to look at an ATX board there and probably an X470 board. For those looking at Ryzen 5 CPUs, this board will handle absolutely anything that you can throw at it with a Ryzen 5 CPU. Overclock it as far as you want. It's not going to be an issue, and needless to say, if you're just going to be buying this motherboard for gaming, again, there's going to be no issues even with a Ryzen 7 CPU for that matter. So overall, I am pretty impressed with what MSI have managed to cram on this little board. Seeing those integrated 60 amp power stages, I honestly did not expect that at all, especially for a B450 board, which is meant to be a mainstream chipset. As always guys, I'd love to hear your thoughts on it down below, so drop a comment. Thanks so much for watching, subscribe if you haven't already, and I will see you all in the next one.